say thank you all for joining. On behalf of the American Sephardic Federation Institute of Jewish Experience and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier, International Program of Yeshiva University, we are very, very happy today to have Professor Judith Roumani and Professor Annette Fromm here, and with an interesting different dynamic that they'll be interviewing each other. I'm going to change your name in a moment, Professor Roumani, sorry about that. And in the meantime, I will hand the stage over. Yeah,
I wondered about that. I was like, wait a minute.
No, it's part of our technical difficulties. But like I said, the talk will make up for it. I will be opening the chat in a moment, so please do share some comments. While Professor Perellis is introducing, I will be opening the other things. So thank you all. And Professor Perellis, the stage is yours.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. This is very exciting. Sephardic Horizons is really has been doing such important work in the world of Sephardic literature and culture and history for so long. And these journals, you know, they only are as good as the people behind them. So
well, it really, we have a great team.
So, you know, and the longevity is a reflection of that, and the quality also. So it's really an honor to have you guys here. And I think people who care about Sephardic history and Sephardic culture and literature really appreciate your work. It's a lot of work and putting these journals together. So it's really very special to have you both here. And my understanding is this is going to Professor Roumani is going to give a presentation about her book, and then there's going to be a conversation with Professor Fromm. Correct? That's right. So let me introduce Professor Fromm first. And then we'll move on to Professor Roumani. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I see that Professor Fromm lives just a few blocks south from where I grew up in Miami Beach. So saludos and greetings to Florida. But Annette Fromm is a folklorist working in museums, serving as director, curator, educator, and museum studies professor. Her MA and PhD in folklore from Indiana University. She directed and taught museum studies at the University of Tulsa and Florida International University. Fromm's book, We Are Few, Folklore and Ethnic Identity of the Jewish Community of Ioannina, Greece, is drawn from in-depth research in Northern Greece. She's associate editor, review editor of the online journal Sephardic Horizons, and she will be in conversation a little bit later with Professor Roumani. And it's my honor to introduce Professor Roumani, who's going to be talking about her new book today. Judith Roumani is founder and director of the Jewish Institute of Pitigliano and founder and editor of the online journal Sephardic Horizons, which appears 3 times a year. She received a BA honors in Spanish and French from the University of Nottingham and an MA in Latin American Studies from the University of London and a PhD in comparative literature from Rutgers. She's taught Spanish and Sephardic studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and other colleges in the Washington, D.C. area. She's also been a director of publications, professional translator, associate editor of author of 5 books and a monograph. And her work has been translated to Hebrew, Italian, and French. And it's my great pleasure to to introduce you to our wider audience and to learn more about your book. So thank you so much. Please, everyone, send your questions into the chat, and we'll have a time for a lively discussion as well. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Judith, do you want to start off or should I?
Please, you start, Annette. I would just like to add a small correction that I'm not actually currently a professor, and I concentrate more on writing and editing with Sephardic Horizons. And so Annette, please go ahead.
Thanks, Judith. Thank you, Professor Perellis, for your kind introduction. I remember meeting you pre-COVID when you were speaking here in Miami, so it's good to see you now. Judith, so I understand you do not have a Sephardic background. What made you interested in this? Can you explain your interest in Sephardic studies?
Oh, well, your question reminds me of something that was written in a review of a book by Nina Lichtenstein on Sephardic women writers. And the reviewer wrote, the reviewer, who is Eunice Abedor of Ben Gurion University, and the review was in our journal Sephardic Horizons, was reading her book on a plane. And someone next to him smiled and made a knowing comment. Seeing the author's name and the title, he said, well, they don't go together. She wouldn't know. This introduced the review. Which actually demonstrated that she did, in fact, understand and know quite well, and had written a very good book. I would say this is the same dilemma that faces many scholars in ethnic studies. Does one have to belong to that ethnic group? Can only Black scholars understand Afro-American literature? Can only Latinos understand Latin American writers, etc.? In my view, it's a political question. I know there's been a lot of water under the bridge in the United States with regard to that question. And I just don't see how relevant it is, actually. Do you have to come from a background of oppression in order to understand literature about racial oppression? What about Latin American scholars who come from quite privileged families and write about their cultures and literatures? Anyway, all I can say is that though my background is not Sephardic, I've belonged to a Sephardic family, my late husband's, he was born in Tunisia and he grew up in Libya. And I was part of his family for about 50 years. And probably I started in Sephardic studies before it even existed as a field in the early 70s. And I think the main thing that is needed in this sort of situation is empathy for the culture and for the people, and of course, plenty of knowledge. And that's just about what I can say on that subject.
Thank you. Thank you. So when you say Sephardic, Sephardi, or Sephardim, what do you yourself mean by those terms?
Well, it's endlessly debated. It's a hot topic continually. And there are, as I see it, there are two approaches, the narrower one and the wider one. And the narrow one defines Sephardim as the Jews who can trace their descent from Spain and Portugal. And there are actually not many of the novelists I deal with who can do that. The broader understanding of these terms includes Jews who follow the Sephardi Nusach, order of service and melodies, Sephardic halakha, and Sephardic minhagim or customs. And this definition came from Daniel Elazar, actually, a sociologist and I think political scientist. And he traces the origin of Sephardic culture back before Iberia to Babylon and the prestige of the Babylonian academies and the Babylonian Talmud across the Middle East and North Africa. And this spread eventually to Spain, and the Arabic Muslim Caliphate in Cordoba, which took up the baton from Babylonia. This has been accepted by many scholars, and I understand also the American Sephardi Federation follows this interpretation.
And so that's also the interpretation that Sephardic Horizons, the journal, takes.
And also Sephardic Horizons, yes.
So we're here today to talk about your book, which I have right here. Yes. Francophone Sephardic Fiction. Why did you choose to write about novelists who write in French?
Well, it wasn't really planned like that. My original project, which was funded by Fulbright, involved writers in Italian and Spanish as well. And the problem with taking a very long time over a research project or a book is that the material keeps growing. The more novels are written, more secondary literature is produced. And eventually I decided I had to focus on one particular aspect if I wanted to finish the book in this lifetime. And it seemed to me there was more coherence among the French writers, more of them. They could also be linked to similar backgrounds and education. And the project took on more focus like that by focusing on French.
Well, in writing about these writers, you bring attention to, you talk a lot about disruption, trauma, tragedies, suffering, yet you also dwell on the humor that they bring. How do you reconcile these opposites?
Well, I don't actually. They are both part of the incoherence of modernity and post-modernity. And I think that a novel by the Tunisian-Swedish writer Claude Kayat called Mohammed Cohen tells us everything in its title. The Tunisian novelist has a character born in the town of Sfax. His mother is a Muslim married to a Jew. To pacify her father, she promises to call her son Mohammed. I don't think that such a thing has ever happened, and it is even less likely to happen today than when it was first published in 1981. And this character embodies the insoluble dilemmas of a Jew born in a Muslim country, appreciating its culture while wanting to express his Jewishness as well. And he grows up in Tunisia, makes Aliyah to Israel, where he is less than welcome when he tries to join the army. And he takes refuge in the French language that he reads and writes, and eventually finds a neutral ground in Sweden, where we are given to understand that no eyebrows are ever raised. The novel is full of jokes and humor. The insoluble dilemmas are treated lightly, but there is an underlying current of tragedy. And then Kayat has a later novel, La Synagogue de Sfax, published in 2006. Though it begins with the same light tone, we even find the character Mohammed Cohen attending synagogue on Yom Kippur. And it actually ends in tragedy as the synagogue is vandalized and the last Jew of Sfax dies. So that's really a tragic novel. And so both humor and tragedy coexist in many novels. Thank
you. In your conclusion, you write about the role of the Mediterranean and how, in fact, in the study of Sephardic literature, the Mediterranean Sea is not involved as Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean does in other literature. Now, Dario Micoli, who has just published a book called Sephardic Sea, takes on this approach. Can you speak about that?
Yes, I think his book probably came out about the same time as mine, so I hadn't read his and he hadn't read mine. But I think if I had read it earlier, I probably wouldn't have written that statement so confidently. I feel that Sephardim have stayed on one side or the other of the Mediterranean, and bridging or being in between is not something they have generally done. He has a photo of the late writer Lucette Lanyadо that many people in the New York area might know. And it's a photo of her at the age of 10 with her father on a ferry boat. They're leaving Egypt, and they look both of them very downcast. They are not envisaging continuing a rich Sephardic cultural life on the other side of the sea. Very few writers dwell on the actual journey, but I can think of Didier Nebo, French writer originally of Algerian origin and before that Spain. He devotes part of his novel to a flight across the Mediterranean from Spain to Algeria in 1492. So I guess in retrospect, it has become a Sephardi sea, but I do accept that Sephardim now can view the Mediterranean as providing a home on both sides, especially through the rose-tinted lens of nostalgia, and by reading books and joining associations and other ways of memorializing the past.
Judith, can you talk a bit about the main factor or the cause leading to the end of Jewish life in Muslim, either your view of it or what the many writers that you include in this book have to say about it?
Mm-hmm. They've written many books about this. Andre Assiman talks about the end, when the end came, a conversation that two of his characters had, his narrator and an uncle. And this phrase embodies the idea that the end was to be expected. Something like predicting the fall of the stock market, I guess. Maybe things were very good for a very long time, but everybody knew or suspected that they had to end. Jews had been in North Africa since before the Muslim invasion, 7th, 8th century, and they had been indigenous. But perhaps if there was any mistake or fault, the fault lay in identifying too much with the idea of new European cultures, especially the French, compared with being oppressed dhimmis, and a supposedly equal status under the French or under the Italians was far preferable. This led to an undervaluing of their indigenous roots. And during the war, European anti-Semitism undermined this security with persecution and deportations, the loss of former rights, even of French citizenship, and very harsh internment camps in North Africa. And there are many historians who have dealt with this. Some take the more lachrymose view that Jews were well rid of the dhimmi status. Others are more nostalgic about the benefits of colonialism for Jews. And Michel Abitbol and other historians have written very extensively about all this.
You spoke a while ago about the dichotomy between disruption, trauma, and humor. What examples do you feel are the most humorous novelist, or the one who is the most tragic?
Okay, well, they're all humorous to some extent. I think Claude Kayat, the one I talked about before, he builds his novel Mohammed Cohen on humor. Many others have humor in their novels. Albert Memmi of Tunisia has some humor in his novel Le Désert, The Desert. Albert Ben Soussan of Algeria and France has humor in his portrayal of the Algerian Jews aping the manners of the metropolitan French. If fantasy is close to humor, one can find tragedy lurking underneath all these all these portraits. Excuse me. I can think of Albert Cohen, who was most influenced by European anti-Semitism. Albert Cohen was from Greece and not North Africa. And despite his comic characters, he has the most serious tone in his portrayal of a runaway adulterous couple who eventually commit suicide out of boredom and the impossibility of finding a place to fit. All this in the Europe under the shadow of Hitler.
So as Professor Parelis introduced me, I'm a folklorist and I work with traditional culture. And the communities from which these writers emerged were often very traditional and also had their forms of traditional narratives. How does traditional storytelling relate to the techniques that you observed in the modern Francophone novels?
Well, you're the right person to ask me this because you have recently published a book about Moroccan storytelling. Yeah. And excuse me, I think the techniques of traditional storytelling influence many modern novels. They help to create the cultural space of Sephardim through spatial techniques of literature. One of the first critics to talk about this was Joseph Frank. There is Jeffrey Smitten and Dagestani, and they have a book, Spatial Form in Literature. The techniques of spatial form avoid the formal momentum in novels. There isn't a storyline that progresses in time. The techniques are undermining plots, the kind of plots that we find in a traditional realist novel. For example, Raphael Levy of Tunis, he writes stories about the ghetto, the Hara of Tunis, what he calls the ghetto. In which different voices tell stories that present the neighborhood from different points of view. Thus, we have an overall picture rather than a narrative that takes us somewhere. Albert Memmi's novel, Le Désert, The Desert, also uses elements from traditional stories in a slightly different way. He presents a medieval nomadic Jewish prince who is totally at home in his surroundings. And he comes into contact with characters named El Kahin and El Ghul. And these remind us of supernatural figures from superstition and tradition. El Kahin is reminiscent of La Kaina, the semi-mythological Jewish queen who resisted the Arab invasions of North Africa. Also, traditional tales have been very important in North Africa, the 1001 Nights with frame stories and folk tales told by men and by women. The tales of Jocha, Secha, Jeha, the wise fool can be told by either men or women, I believe. And I just wanted to say that in the next issue of Sephardic Horizons, we're going to have an interview with Albert Memmi, who talks a lot about the influence of folk tales on his writing. And I haven't yet mentioned Khurafa, which are the tales told by men. They have moral endings and proverbs, and the tales told by women, which are humorous. So different kinds of stories.
Excuse me, along that same vein, how do you feel that modernity and postmodernity affect traditions and traditional
Modernity and post-modernity hit the immigrants at the same time. Older people perhaps were better able to cope, in my view, but this might be debatable. Younger people who attended university in France and other European or Western countries and had to forge modern professional identities for themselves felt perhaps more like the Algerian origin Jacques Derrida, who said, I'll start that again. Je n'ai qu'une langue, which is French, obviously, et ce n'est pas la mienne. I only have one language, and it isn't mine. Others, like Hélène Cixous, reminisced about the multilingualism of the Algeria she remembered. The disruptions and incoherence of their lives perhaps predisposed many younger Sephardim to post-modernity, and in the study of literature, to Derrida's deconstruction. Derrida himself was somewhat suspicious of meaning, calling thought the illusory autonomy of a discourse or a consciousness to be deconstructed, which to me sounds a bit scary. And then, of course, there is displacement, one of the essential psychological and literary techniques of post-modernity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by terms that you use in your text, cultural space and portable homeland?
Yeah. Well, this question really follows on from the one about spatial form. I think one can extend the idea of spatial form into one of cultural space, a cultural homeland of the heart, not a physical place for it. For example, one chapter in my book is about the cultural space of Tunisian Jews, and it juxtaposes a writer from the 20s and 30s, Rivel, who I already mentioned, with the contemporary Marco Koskas and his novel about the small town of Nabeul in Tunisia before the Exodus. His novel is Balas Bounel. The voices of those now in France recreate a whole universe of small town types with humor and nostalgia, a cultural space where Jews lived according to tradition, but treated it lightheartedly, something between Helm and Buchach, if I can pronounce that right, in Shayagnon's terms. In any case, it lives on, somewhat transformed in this novel. A similar idea is described by Memmi in his portable homeland. On his desk, he would keep things like a little amber, spices, leather that would bring Tunisia back via the senses and inspire him to write. I don't think he invented the term portable homeland, but he did make it his own. And another Tunisian writer, Nin Moati, also had a Tunisian decor that would inspire her.
Judith, can you briefly explain the interesting relationship between Albert Memmi, about whom you've written quite a bit, and Naim Katan?
Naim Katan moved from Iraq to Canada, and Memmi moved from Tunisia to France. They were contemporaries. They both wrote in French, and each was aware of the other's writing. Memmi called Katan mon semblable, mon frère, my likeness, my brother. And they even published with the same publisher. Both grew up speaking their respective Judeo-Arabic, and they were proud of that, even emphasizing their Jewish accents. But above all, in their writing, they focused on embarrassing moments, cultural incongruities, the uncomfortable position of Jews steeped in Arabic culture, who also identified with European culture. Memmi turned it into a sort of philosophy, while Katan didn't. And they both have passed away rather recently, but they've been a considerable inspiration to younger writers.
Why do you consider the year 1992 to be so important?
Well, 1992 was the quincentenary of the expulsion from Spain. Many books came out on 1492. I already mentioned Didier Nebot's novel. There were conferences and symposia, and most important, Sephardim began to draw parallels with recent expulsions from Arab lands in their own time. For example, in the case of Algeria, 30 years previously, 62. After 1992, and over the next decade or so, more historical novels came out than previously. At least that's my impression.
Who are the up-and-coming novelists that you could refer our listeners to?
Okay, well, I'll just talk about my favorites. Haim Sabato, who lives in Jerusalem. He writes about Syrian Jews who were sent to a refugee camp near Jerusalem. He writes in Hebrew, so I don't actually discuss him in my book, but he's called the Sephardic Agnon, and makes considerable use of folk tales in his writing. Another one, Moise Ben Arosh, who writes in Spanish and Hebrew about Spanish-speaking Jews from Tetuan in Morocco. Patrick Modiano, who is already a Nobel Prize winner, so perhaps he doesn't quite qualify as up and coming because he's already got there. He explores his family situation, very dysfunctional. He focuses on signs of identity and how identity was obfuscated during the Holocaust. The doubtful and concealed stories of collaborators, the gray zone of those who collaborated in order to survive, and how deliberate amnesia covers this up. My favorite novel of his is La Rue des Boutiques Obscures, the street of dark shops. Forgetting is also a form of remembering. André Aciman, who writes in a Proustian style in English about his family, remembering, so-called remembering, of how his grandmothers met in Alexandria and engineered the marriage of his parents, leading to himself. Ami Bouganim of Morocco and Israel. The trees cry, Le Cri de l'Arbre, once uprooted, a group of Moroccan Jews from Essaouira, or Mogador as it was, are forever mobilized, and this is a lyrical and humorous novel. Colette Felous, again a Tunisian origin writer, takes us back to when her grandfather, as a young man, made the decision that French was the future, and he made this decision not only for himself, but for all of his descendants. The consequence was that her brother, one consequence among many, her brother visiting from France for a summer vacation is hauled into a police station in Tunis. Because he can't speak Arabic, he is then deprived forever of the right to renew his Tunisian passport, thus definitively cutting him off from his roots.
Wow.
And Didier Nebot also has a novel about La Kahena, who I mentioned before, the Jewish Berber queen who led the resistance against the Arab Muslim invaders. And I could go on, but I like many of the novelists.
This is a long list that really opens a lot for the future, but I think I only heard the name of one woman writer. Why do there seem to be fewer, or do you have any thoughts of why there are fewer women novelists? than
Oh.
men in this body of work?
Okay, good question. I think it's been harder for a woman than a man to write fiction and be taken seriously, and of course to find a publisher if you're from one of the Middle East or North African countries. But there are novelists, women novelists, and there have been for some time. And I could mention Elisa Rais, born in the late 19th century. She was the divorced wife of a rabbi. That wasn't her name. And she caught the eye of a French publisher and then moved to France. And there she assumed an Oriental or exotic personality as a Muslim woman. And she rode to popularity in literary salons. It has even been alleged that she was actually illiterate and her nephew wrote her novels. But hard to prove either way. Blanche Ben-Dahan, who was born in 1903. She was born in Oran, Algeria, and the family moved to France when she was a child, so very early. Her first novel was published when she was 27. In general, I think women novelists have usually had another profession, such as journalist or lawyer, or both, as well as writing novels. But it's also very common among men. So let me mention a couple more. Clarice Nekoitsky. She was from the Balkans and moved to France. She's a favorite of mine. And her novel, Couvre-feu, Curfew, depicts the curfews of Lyon during the Nazi occupation, through the mind of a little Jewish girl, 3-year-old girl, in hiding during the war. And it's actually quite funny, the misunderstandings of this little 3-year-old. And then another one, Nina Moati, I already mentioned. She's another favorite of mine. And her novel, Les Belles de Tunis, about the Gorni or the Livorno Jews who were living in Tunis in the 19th and early 20th century. This has been published in France and then in Tunis, and it's also being translated into Arabic, a very popular novel. So that's about it. Oh, no, I have a few more. Let me think.
Of course you do.
Yes. Shoshana Buchupsa writes about a young woman who takes her family to Jerusalem, and then she herself returns to France. And this gives rise to all sorts of dilemmas and problems that affect many Sephardic families these days. Annie Fitoussi and Annie Cohen. One has a sort of surrealistic rabbi, Mushi Rabinu, and the other has a marabout who surface in France to remind Sephardim of their North African roots. Also, semi-humorous novels with a serious undercurrent. Colette Felous, I think I already talked about. And Giselle Halimi is another one. She was a fighting lawyer who represented women's issues and other controversial subjects in France. And she wrote a novel about La Kahina. Again, I think there are 9 novels about this character, La Kahina. She presents her as very brave and very cruel. And well, those are my favorites. There are many, and I wish I had been able to do more justice to them, perhaps in another book.
Well, just a reminder, this is Judith Roumani, who is the editor of Sephardic Horizons, an online journal, and her recent book, Francophone Sephardic Fiction. I know there's a lot of questions. Drora, do you want to field that, or should I skim through and try to find the question?
Well, first, I do want to say that I also want to add that Judith Roumani is also the editor of the Sephardic series of Lexington Books, which is
Yes.
very close to my heart since I published a book there. So I do have to say that that's an important aspect also. So a lot of the questions here are questions about this person or that person. I'm going to start with Joyce Yarrow's question. Have you read Aleph Bet Yoshua's novel, A Journey to the End of the Millennium? And if so, please comment.
Oh, of course. I think it's a wonderful novel. I could have talked about Aleph Bet Yehoshua for an hour, just him. I think he's been extremely important among Sephardic writers. He's been an incredible example, but here I was talking mainly about Francophone writers, so he didn't quite fit in. But I have written a little about him. I had an article in Sephardic Horizons. I've also interviewed him, and I really admire his work very much. He should not be overlooked.
Either one of you want to read the questions off, and I will invite people to open their cameras and their microphones?
I can read them off. Let me skim up again to the top, because there were some very good questions. I know somebody asked about authors living in France, and Judith in her last answer referred to quite a few who are. Judith, you spoke about the situation of Jews during the war in Morocco, in North Africa, and though this question is not about literature, were there no internment camps in Morocco? Daniel Scher wanted to know.
I'm not an expert on internment camps. I think there are several books on the Holocaust in North Africa, or the long reach of the Holocaust.
I do want to say that we just did a podcast with Professor Riva Spector-Simon, who wrote about the Holocaust in North Africa and the Middle East. So I recommend her book.
Okay, thank you.
Claire Cohen asked about a website to read more about this literature. And of course, I refer you to SephardicHorizons.org. Judith just referred to another article, but there's a number of articles about the literature in French, Sephardic literature. ML asked if you mentioned Camus in this book.
I don't think, I may have had one mention of Camus. He was obviously a model, even though he wasn't a Jewish writer, but I'm sure he was a model for many of these writers. And one thing that I noticed about Camus is he enjoyed the multilingualism of North African towns. This is obviously during the colonial period. I'm not sure whether he spoke Arabic himself. I don't think so, but he certainly enjoyed the multilingual atmosphere that many other writers have commented on.
Another question, a little bit long. What are the complications you suggest are typical for Sephardic Jews in the context of a Sephardic woman who brings her family to Israel and then returns to France?
The complications relate to identity. I think they relate to possibly unrealistic expectations of Zionism and the actual situations that characters encounter, and she has different boyfriends actually who embody these different attitudes.
Our dear friend Rachel Bortnick, I think you're in Dallas, Rachel, has two questions. First is, are you familiar with Albert Mitrani's novel, Rachelika? And of all the books that you've mentioned, what has been translated into English?
Oh, not much has been translated into English. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with Rashalika. Is it in French?
Rachel will get back with us.
All right.
Oh, I think she's nodding.
Yeah,
There
you
she
can open
is.
your microphone, Rachel.
Nodding.
You can open your
Okay,
microphone.
no, there's a hole in my reading that I will try to fill. And
You have to open your microphone, Rachel. That's why we don't hear you.
oh, if she nodded, that's enough.
She nodded.
Oh, okay. Okay, she was
Daniel
saying something.
Zaroff asks, can you repeat the name of the author who writes about Spanish-speaking Jews in Tetuan?
Oh, Moïse, M-O-I-S, Benarosh, B-E-N-A-R-R-O-C-H.
Writes, not fiction, but can you comment about Jacques Attali's history?
No, I'm sorry, I don't know much about Jacques Attali. I only know that he's Sephardic. He was the head of the, I think it was a European Development Bank when it was first founded. I'm afraid I don't know much about him.
And Lisa Melilli asks, can we get a reading list? And also what's available in English? When I read the book, a world of literature opened up to me, although I'm not a quick French reader. I don't know if Judith has a reading list or if she would just say, buy the book.
Reading list. Offhand, let me think about what's in English or in French is the.
No, I've lost it. Sorry.
A basic reading list. Well, I myself translated a novel by Albert Memmi, and the classics, I suppose. Albert Cohen, the one who was originally from Corfu and moved to France. Belle du Seigneur is the title of the English translation of his French novel with the same title. Albert Cohen, Albert Ben Soussan of Algeria. I'm not sure whether any of his books have been translated at all. I'm sorry, but he's an excellent writer. Ami Bouganim, who lives in Israel, originally from Morocco, also a very good writer. And trying to think whether his books have been translated, but I think not. And Claude Kayat, Mohammed Cohen, I know that has been translated. Many good novels, but very few translations.
Carol, excuse me, wrote, how do French speakers fit in Israeli culture? Carolyn Herbst?
Yes, I'm asking that particularly because I've studied in Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the summer, and they do offer courses in English and Spanish and French. And of course, I took mine in English, but I never ran into French speakers in Israeli culture, and I was wondering how they fit in.
Oh, well, there are many French speakers in Jerusalem. I think that language is a bit of a barrier. There are many English speakers in Jerusalem and, of course, Hebrew speakers. But how do they fit in? You know, large groups who speak a different language have a disincentive to fit in, actually. The Russians, the French, and the English speakers, since there are so many of them, it's a disincentive, really. It's an effort to Hebrew is not an easy language, and it's quite an effort for English speakers, maybe slightly less for French speakers, I'm not sure, but initially, at least, people tend to congregate to their own linguistic group in the beginning. Hopefully not forever.
Joyce Yarrow poses a really interesting question in today's world. Do you think, and this might be out of your knowledge base, do you think some literature may emerge written by Jews who've returned to Spain recently under the new law?
That's to be seen. I don't know. That would be very interesting. The writer I mentioned, Moïse Ben-Arosh, he lives in Jerusalem, but he writes in Spanish and Hebrew. I think he's returned fairly frequently to, not frequently, but he has returned to Tetuan. I think that's his origin. And that's Morocco, Spanish-speaking Morocco. Also, he's visited Spain as a writer, as an Israeli writer. I learned this from his novels, actually. And he has a rather funny novel about a lost scarf. He lost a scarf on a literary visit to Spain, and the novel is about the scarf and how he relates to it, because it was rather cold in Spain and he missed it. Anyway, I don't know whether they will all be on that level. I thought it was funny, but one cannot really say it's that significant. Perhaps the scarf is symbolic of Sephardic identity. I'm not sure, we should ask him. But it's very interesting, an interesting idea.
Rachel
I'm going to
Bortnick.
interrupt. Yeah.
Can I
was
just
what
add
was
one
gonna-
comment? Rachel Bortnick added in that Mitrani's book, Rachelika, is in French, and it's a recently published book. Daniel Scher wrote in, there's a Moroccan-Spanish writer who lives in Spain, works for Casa Sepharad in Madrid, and has written various novels in Spain. Esther Bendahan, her novel about her family's exodus from Morocco is called Déjalo, que yo volveremos. Drora, I hand it to you now.
No, I just saw that Rachel had her hand up, so I was wondering if that was on purpose. Nope. Okay, then it's back to you, Annette. If there's one more comment or question you want to ask.
I think that Claire Cohen posits that she'd like to read about the history of the Livornese. It's such a vast topic here and so much to be written about. If I may say, I just returned from Albania, where a Jewish museum is being planned and where I found a lost family member. So that's another kind of black hole, Albanian Judaism and Jews, and how do they fit into our Sephardic world? So, Drora, I hand it back to you.
I'm just going to thank both of you, Dr. Roumani and Professor Fromm, and thank you all for joining us. And we will send the link to the Sephardic Horizons as well as the link to the book in the follow-up email. Please do stay in touch. We have more exclusive author series coming up. So follow us, be on our mailing list, and thank you both so much. There's so much to talk about here, and we'll have to continue.